one of the skills that we've been focusing on in this unit is to get students to ask good inquiry questions. To do that, we started with the flow chart with a picture in the middle, and then around the edge is where students wrote down their basic information-seeking questions. You need to start with those basic questions. Who's in the picture? What are they doing? What do they represent? And so on. And I have them use stickies because they can move them around and they can cluster them depending on the topic and so on. The next step that we took was to talk about criteria for good inquiry questions. Over here on the wall I've got the end result of that, where students came up with criteria for good inquiry questions. They actually came up with these specifics, and then we clustered them together to make criteria for good questions.
Have a question
that can lead to bigger questions.
Yeah, that could lead to like bigger topics.
Different questions answered.
Yes.
Like a variety of
like
questions
that
can be answered.
A lot of questions you actually make just lead to other questions that end up being
Exactly. Okay.
Allowing students to create their own success criteria enables them to gain an ownership of their learning. And also allows them to put it in their own words so it's more meaningful to them. It makes more sense to them. When I allow students to create their success criteria, for example, the criteria for a good inquiry question, I go into that with some knowledge of what those students are likely to come up with. I know for when it comes to criteria for a good inquiry question, for example, they're going to mention things like that it should be an open-ended question. It should lead them to getting some kind of detail, but not be too detailed. It should lead to other questions. They should be interesting or touch on people's thoughts and their feelings. And these are things that I can kind of guide them through as well as they're working in their groups and I'm coming around and conferencing with them. But of course, there's always going to be criteria that they come up with that I haven't thought of. And to me, that's the most exciting part. Once you've clustered the criteria that they come up with and you've talked about them, then seeing if you can fit those outliers somewhere, or perhaps they become a criterion of their own. And then each class ends up with their own set of criteria, and it makes sense to them, it's in their own words, and then they apply their own criteria to their own work. Answerable, not obvious, what do you want to call it? Answerable? You just want to watch me try to spell that. Answerable. So answer. You started with your basic information-seeking questions, and where we're going to go now with the criteria that we've developed, I'm going to help you to develop deeper inquiry questions, and on our flow chart I have different colored sticky notes, and we'll start putting those inquiry questions around the outside.
It'll tell us what can we have a good topic, and it'll give us the criteria for good questions, so will we have a better answer, we'll have a better idea of what it all means in the picture.
Okay. So as you work out from the picture, you're going to have probably even better questions as you go further out. And those are the questions that you're going to really pick up on for your inquiry.
How many questions should we have at the end?
You only need one good question.
Oh.
You probably have to ask a lot to get to that one good question, right? So don't worry too much about number. Worry about what's happening in that picture. You got to figure that out. It's like a puzzle. Okay?
Groups, and we each chose this cartoon, and so we're building up to make our own cartoon, and in the cartoon we're trying to figure out like what it represents and what it is. So we're getting questions that we can kind of figure out what does the cartoon represent. So by building these questions we can learn further into our topic.
Is it hard to ask a good question?
Yes. Well, because like you look at so many other people's questions and you're like, whoa, that's really good. How did they think of that? And then you try to think of something, and then it's really hard because you're trying to like make it open-ended, you're trying to make it closed, and then you're trying to use your topic and other topics, and you're all trying to make them into one, and then you get little questions and bigger questions, and it's interesting. It's a different way of learning, and it just like kind of sparks new ideas of how you can learn and get answers.
I sense a question envy. When you see a good one? When you see a good one, do you recognize it?
Yeah.
So what makes a good question? I know you talked about criteria, but what do you think?
Being like not having a question that's too reserved, so like having a question that can move on to other questions, and the question is open-ended. It can answer several questions, I think, kind of like
Not too specific, like
yeah.
it's not right down to the topic.
Mhm.
It's a bit broader, and you have more ideas.
But don't you need some other smaller questions to answer that bigger question? Do you do that kind of thing too?
Yeah, well that's kind of like
Yeah.
what we started with, like with
Yeah,
the,
where it kind of like branches off into other topics, and
Yeah.
then it kind of like comes back to the main topic of what you're talking about.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
a flow chart, kind of what we're
Yeah,
working on.
exactly.
Yeah.
because we just kind of moved on to the blue
Sticky
sticky
notes.
notes, which are like the more in detailed ones.
Yeah.
So
So
yeah.
do you like the blue questions or the yellow sticky note questions?
Blue ones.
Blue, yeah. They're
Yeah,
better.
they're harder to make, and it challenges you to make an inquiry question. Like, to make a good, solid inquiry question, you really gotta think about it,
Okay.
and like use all of your information, and that's where you use like the regular questions that kind of move you into the inquiry questions. So
Great.
Yeah.
And now yeah.
So my question, I like my question because it's all about the Pacific scandal, and I get to look at election results and percentages and how many people voted and stuff. And I like looking at that kind of stuff. And it's really interesting for me because I get to see, let's say, the Conservatives where a lot they lost, but not by too much.
One of the surprises for me about the inquiry process was just how engaged students were throughout it. I found that it helped them to individualize their learning. Each student seemed to have their own journey throughout. It was good in two ways. It helped them to be motivated and interested in their learning, and also helped them to work from where they were at, so that regardless of the student, every one of them felt a personal success as they worked their way through to the culminating task.
The beauty of this collaborative inquiry is that whatever level you're at, if you have a modified program, or if you are even being accommodated, you're able to kind of create or develop inquiry questions from multiple entry points. So based on your level, based on your level of understanding of a topic, based on your interest in the topic. So I think that identified students are able to be part of a focused discussion with their peers, which is really important, especially at this age, especially at this middle school level, and then use those questions and further develop those questions with teacher guidance and teacher feedback, just to further develop their own higher order thinking skills. So embedded within the whole collaborative inquiry process is that kids are differentiating their own learning. They're taking charge of their own learning. They're able to kind of identify their own, maybe they're not consciously doing it, but they're able to see where their level is, see where they're at, and then further kind of push themselves and push their own thinking. And it challenges their it challenges their whole thought process.